Good evening. I know it's very late, so I'll try and be as brief as possible. I understand it has been a long day and a long week as well. Sorry, this is not my name. This is the name of my boss. My name is Marino. I'm from Pori Management Consulting, a consulting company dedicated to energy. We do a lot of market analysis, market design, and strategy in the energy sector, and specifically into the gas and electricity sectors. And I personally lead the advisory in Italy regarding the electricity market. I will briefly, as I said, trying to free you as soon as possible, discuss about market design. It's not going to be a thorough discussion. Obviously, the topic is very huge, but just the idea is to discuss with you some of the lessons learned from the European markets and some potential hints for the design of electricity markets in countries where the market is not yet developed and needs to be developed kind of from scratch. Okay. Europe has had a very long history of developing renewables. Let's say that our renewable experience dates back to the early 90s, when the first European markets have been liberalized, open, privatized. And the first policies regarding renewable energy date to the late 90s, okay, starting from 1996. And then they have been fully developed into the early 2000s. And they have seen their, let's say, the development, the big development has been taken place starting from 2005 until 2010-11. And then obviously there's been a hit by the financial crisis and the decrease of investment. But as you can see, the development has been quite quick and in very few years. This has led to a number of results. A lot of investments deployed, a lot of capacity installed, great externalities also for the rest of the world, because thanks to the efforts that have been done in Europe, costs of the renewable technologies have decreased dramatically, as you know, for PV, wind. Obviously, PV is the most striking example, and this has been made possible by these deployment. But has everything gone smoothly? No, not really. And also, part of the decrease in investments that we are experiencing in these years in Europe is obviously caused by the financial crisis we have been going through, but not only from that. There have been some design issues. Obviously, we were kind of the forerunner in the world, so we made a number of mistakes. Today, designing a mechanism can benefit from the mistakes we have done in the past. But what I'm saying is that the financial crisis has not been the only element why today things have gone, the investments have decreased, but there's been some design issues that are causing today the renewables industry in Europe to be stuck. We've had some badly designed incentive mechanisms. We have had an increase of installations that has not been anticipated. So things have gone much quicker than expected, and this is probably the element number one. And the third element is that the level of penetration of renewables has been very high in some countries, and the consequences of this penetration had not been anticipated by the regulators in Europe. So some lessons learned are that things tend to go very quick. Technological development is surprising, and things in 5, 6, 7 years will be probably much different than they are today. And the market design needs to to anticipate these and create an environment which is forward-looking into the future. We have had, as you probably know, the European markets are mostly based on short-term markets. In most developing countries and developing markets, there are a lot of, let's say, the paradigm is more long-term PPAs for electricity, while Europe has developed investments based on spot markets. The presence of renewables, would go a bit deeper into these later. The presence of renewables has had some consequences on these markets that have not yet been solved. The so-called cannibalization effect, we'll see what it is exactly. Some countries have undergone a lot of overspending. They have set tariffs and they've not controlled properly the development of renewables. And the amount of expenditure after some years has revealed unaffordable for some countries that have had to review their incentive systems, sometimes retroactively, and this has undermined the confidence of investors, and some countries are currently stuck and have a lot of difficulties in attracting investments in renewables again. And the last point, but not the least, has been the effect on the grids and the dispatching of renewables, which has not been anticipated. Investments have not been properly taken into account, and therefore this has led in a number of countries, as you've probably been discussing with some previous speakers, power cuts or needs to decrease the production, and so an inefficient system. In this way, and now we are somehow running behind the investments in the distribution and transmission grids which are necessary. Had they been anticipated and planned in advance, things would have gone more smoothly. I just mentioned here the Middle East. Why I'm mentioning here the Middle East, because we're speaking about Europe, but what is going on? There are some markets which are kind of midway in their between emerging markets and mature countries like Italy. In the Middle East, which has a longer story than other markets, what's going on? They have still a market based on PPAs, but since a number of PPAs are starting to expire, they're for the first time tackling from the other side the same issue of how to make a market based on PPAs compatible with short-term markets once that PPAs do expire. So the debate today in Europe is on how to define a renewable policy. Having a wider perspective, renewable policy is not simply defining an incentive mechanism or a revenue stream. It's much more than that, and you need to take into account the overall energy policy. And all relevant aspects of the market make a difference when you design a renewable policy. The first one is the interaction between revenue streams to renewables and other instruments. One of the big issues we have been facing has been the interaction between the so-called CO2 market. In Europe, there is a Europe-wide so-called ETS system, so system for trading of emission certificates, and that was designed to drive renewable policies. But at the same time, this market has been, that this was a European-wide market. At the same time, each single state has created its own incentive system for renewables, which has in turn cannibalized the CO2 market, and which has collapsed 2 times, and well, 3 times now. And there's a big question mark on what the future of the CO2 market will be. So the first big hint that comes from European history is pay attention when you're designing a framework for renewables to all the instruments that you are designing, because there might be perverse effects of one system cannibalizing another. The second one, as I was mentioning earlier, is which is the form of the market you are going to, let's say, in which your renewables will be deployed. As you know, you can design markets like more spot markets or long-term markets. With forward markets, kind of, let's say spot markets are usually day ahead, intraday markets. Long-term markets means to me some years, then can depend 5, 6, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, PPIs. It depends on the technology. Forward markets are kind of in the middle. They're kind of hedging instrument for spot markets with a duration and with a time horizon of 2 or 3 markets. The basic discussion which is going on today in Europe is between how to tackle renewables in a world based on spot markets. Why these? I'll go and then I'll come back. This is what happened. As I was saying earlier, European markets are based on spot markets. So energy is priced day ahead, intraday, short term, and then there are some few hedging instruments to give people a kind of 2 or 3 years visibility and opportunity to hedge their position with a longer time frame. What happened with renewables? As you know, renewables are zero marginal cost technologies. So when you beat a zero marginal cost technology on a spot market, they will beat basically at zero. So what's going on today is that spot markets are not being able to cope to make the right price signals, because prices tend to go towards zero in many hours. If you can see here it's just the number of hours in which prices have gone to zero in Germany. This is 2015, 150 hours around, and this trend is growing. So the risk that spot markets will not be able to reflect correctly prices, marginal prices and marginal costs is very high. As a consequence, what about investments? At the same time, spot markets, short-term markets, are a very useful tool in order to give price signals, because you know how much energy is worth, you know how much other services are worth. So for instance, ancillary services, flexibility services, all the services which are needed to properly manage the system. So this debate is very huge now, and in Europe we start from a spot market position, while in new markets the tendency is to start from a very long-term market position with long-term PPA. And therefore we have a kind of trade-off between efficiency, short-term efficiency, and long-term security. And let's say that probably the truth stands in the middle, and this is a very crucial point in designing a new policy, because short markets only will not work, but at the same time, if you make a system which is made up of fixed contracts for 15 or 20 years for the 100% of your generation, it's unlikely to be a long-term, a system stable in the long term. Because at a point in time, there will be some technologies which will undercut your costs, and we are seeing these in several countries, and then you will have a big question mark to manage. The second point, as I was mentioning, is that designing a policy is much more than designing a revenue stream. This includes designing the revenue streams, obviously, but also, as I was mentioning, the proper wholesale market, so proper balance between wholesale, short-term and long-term, between energy markets and services markets. And the last point is obviously RES dispatching, which rules will allow, how will RES be dispatched. And the last one is to decide grid access and regulation. All of these is very relevant, and it obviously becomes more relevant the higher the percentage of renewables with respect to the overall market. So a couple of discussion regarding how to design a new policy in a developing market. Obviously, the aim is obviously to guarantee system security, to ensure a balanced growth of demand and capacity, to achieve probably environmental targets, and everything needs to be done at the minimum cost, with a trade-off. So in the short run, there is a big need to attract investors in markets which are usually, obviously not all of them, but the vast majority of emerging markets are characterized by vertically integrated utilities, dealing from production, generation, distribution, transmission, sales. So you are setting up a policy usually based on long-term PPAs, but in 5–10 years you will probably faced with a different environment. How will the market look like in 5–10 years is a very big question. So will it look like a more liberalized market, unbundled between the different parts of the value chain? Will it be based on large public infrastructures with diffuse generation? So you need to design a market which is, in the short term, attract investors in this environment, but in the long term, needs to create solutions that are economically viable and sustainable in the long run. What have we seen? The first message is there is no instrument which is valid for every single season. We have experienced a number of incentive systems. Now I wouldn't call them incentive systems anymore, because now probably renewables in many countries are totally comparable in terms of cost to thermal generation. So I wouldn't call incentive system anymore, I would call revenue streams. Today we're in the age, we're in the age of PPA auctions. PPA auctions are very fashionable, very useful. They're probably the right instrument in this moment, but we've seen other instruments going forward. At the beginning of the century, the most fashionable thing in Europe was certificates trading. So you were obliged to have a certificate of for each unit of renewable production you were either producing, or you were obliged to have certificates for the electricity that you were selling to final customers. This is theoretically what economists like a lot, because it's theoretically very efficient, but it proved in several instances, from the CO2 market to the several green certificates, so-called green certificate system we experienced in Europe, in Italy for instance, very difficult system to maintain from a policy perspective. Politicians tend to change their mind, and if you have a system that needs continuous maintenance, that may be very difficult. And basically, apart from some very stable countries like Sweden or Norway, which managed to bring forward their system for 20 years, all the other systems that I know have been abandoned in Italy, for instance, in Romania, for instance, and in other countries. But still, they're there and they're efficient. So then we have had the era of feed-in tariffs. Everyone was using feed-in tariffs. They're very stable. People liked a lot. And they had a very great advantage. Feed-in tariffs were able to mobilize also low-size investments. But my main issue is no cost minimization, for two reasons. First of all, the regulator is not always able to give the right price to the technology. Second, it tends to react maybe slowly. And when you have a growth of renewables, as we've seen earlier, I mean, there have been years in which in 6 months the installed capacity doubled. So if the delay in responding to these is 6 months or 1 year, which is normal from a regulatory or legislative perspective, then your overspending can be huge. But still, they've been abandoned not everywhere, but mostly abandoned feed-in tariffs, but still they have been quite useful, for instance, in mobilizing low size capacity and generation. Now we are in the era of PPAs, as I was saying. Starting from emerging markets, they've been imported into most European countries, and they tend to be very good from the cost minimization perspective, and in order to discover the actual value of technology. So very efficient, high competition, question mark, how good are they in allowing a more diffused generation? So very good for large installations, but what if the next step of the industry will be diffused generation? The second point has been RES dispatching, as I was mentioning, that at the very beginning, in all European countries, renewables were given priority of dispatch, just produce, no obligations. Then in some countries that has started creating quite an amount of cost for balancing the system, and therefore the second step has been to give them some financial penalties for imbalances, so balancing responsibilities. Now we are in the era of how shall we let renewables contribute to the system or pay for it. So the third era will be designing a proper dispatching which allows them either to contribute, maybe with the help of storage, or to pay for it. So in terms of policy and market design, just a few words on what could be the next steps, and given the lessons learned from our markets. Obviously, PPAs are very good in this stage of development of the markets because they allow to mobilize the industry to reduce costs, to give confidence to investors, to allow for a new industry to be born, reduce administrative costs, and so on, and so on, and so on. So PPAs are the good instrument in this moment. But as I was saying earlier, if I was a policymaker in a new market, I would start also thinking to the next generation. Because in a little time, there will be some different elements. First of all, as I mentioned, no more subsidies but revenue streams. So no need for subsidies in many countries. It's designing revenues for renewables is designing a proper, how they can catch a proper revenue streams, not an incentive. New technologies are, and I think you've been speaking about that quite widely in this week, are coming. Cost of storage, as you know, has been decreasing significantly, and it's likely to still decrease very significantly in the next years. So it's probably going to be a competitive technology. Systems in Europe that have allowed the value of storage to be properly priced in the markets, Germany, for instance, or UK, have seen, well, in UK there is 1.5 gigawatts, which is going to be installed in the next 2 years, and there is 6 gigawatts of batteries, of projects for batteries, which are there just ready to go on the market. So, and this has been achieved in a really short time. So technologies are there. Second point is, what is the scarce resource? Is it energy or is it infrastructures? So distribution, transmission, and so on. As a consequence, I think it's really time, and I know it's difficult to, there's a lot of things to do, but it's probably time, while pushing on PPIs, to start preparing the new markets. And this requires at least thinking of, there is no solution, as I wrote there, there's no yet any predefined solution, it's still work in progress. But it's important to start thinking of how to create and integrate short-term markets that allow the value of energy of services to emerge and to have the right price signals that needs to be combined with long-term contracts. In the long run, it's likely that small-size installations will come back on the market as soon as costs go down. So a diffuse generation will be diffuse generation will be an important part of the development of many countries. They played a big role in Italy, for instance. I mean, particularly small-size PV. It played a great role in the development of our industry. And it's likely to come back on the scene as well. But which is the right instrument in order to allow them to come back on the market? As I said, finding the right balance between long-term and short-term, and consider, when defining the revenue streams, not only energy, but also all the ancillary services that needs to be either paid for or procured to the system by renewables, as by any other technology. So renewables today are in competition with other technologies, maybe a privileged competition because of their environmental externalities, but from a purely electrical market point of view, they can start competing on all the spectrum of the services that can be provided to the system. The third point, which comes from the certificates market, is obviously an efficient policy should allow for regional exchanges. The fact that in Europe every country has done its own programs without coordinating with other countries, or with little coordination with other countries, we had, at least in principle, some instruments to allow for transfers of rights, of duties of renewable production from one country to the other, but they actually never worked. That has proved very costly for our continent. There have been countries which have inefficiently produced a lot of renewable energy in conditions which were not necessarily the best ones from a natural resource perspective. And therefore, in a more medium-term time horizon, the suggestion would be to shift the public guarantees, which is probably the scarce resource today, from energy to setting up the proper infrastructures that allow the development of renewables, which will come probably in few years by the market. So that create the competitive environment that will allow new renewables to be installed and new investments to come into your countries. Thanks to all of you. Thank you.